Welcome to our module on quotes and contracts. In this video, you will learn how to add and manage quotes, the parts of a quote, quote types and stages and workflows, notifications, and how to print quotes. Managing a client's budget starts from the intake process and continues throughout the duration of the client's services with your organization. As coordinators, you need to ensure that no one is left out of pocket and that clients get the most out of their funding while you assist them in achieving their goals. The quote and budget capability allows you to build out quotes for leads and active clients, and to easily use these quotes to generate agreements. The client quote brings together the ability to quote a client on a single screen. It includes the funding streams, fees, recurring, and one-off service charges. Let's get started by creating a quote. There are several ways for you to create a quote in CareVision. If you are in the process of creating and reviewing all quotes across the organization, you can go to the Quotes and Contracts action board by clicking on Actions, and then Quotes and Contracts, and then pressing the Create Quotes and Contracts button on the upper right-hand side of the screen. If you're doing something else or you're in a hurry to create a quote, you can click on the Quick Actions icon on the bottom right-hand side of the screen and select Create a Quote. You will then be prompted for the client's name when you're adding a quote this way and through the Quotes and Contracts action board. The most logical place to add a quote, however, in terms of client management, is from the client profile. On the clients list, you can click on a lead or active client, and on the Quick Actions under the profile, you can click on Create Quote or Contract icon. As I mentioned earlier, the quotes have several components. Up top, we have the quote header, where you can see the basic information such as who created the quote, the date when the quote was initially created, and the quote reference. The quote reference is an auto-generated quote number. This increments per organization branch, which is important for organizations with multiple branches. Since this is a draft quote, the reference field will remain blank. However, when we save the quote, it will show an auto-generated number. The quote type allows you to have different print format layout templates. So in this case, an HCP quote may look different than the NDIS quote. The status indicates where the quote is in the process. There are different workflows and notifications around this, which will be explained later. The valid until field defaults to 30 days from created date and indicates when the pricing on the quote expires. The first quote component is fund sources. To get started, I'll just click on the plus icon on the right side of the Fund Sources section. Now you can see the fields that we need to fill out. Funding sources are added from the organization's funding source templates and contain the rules and details of the funding and subsidies that the client is entitled to. If you do not have funding source templates in your organization, check out our knowledge base or contact our support team. The funding source is the source of income for the clients to avail your services. There are default funding source templates set up to make it easier for you to set up a new client. By having funding source templates, you do not need to input everything over and over again. You just need to update whatever you need, like the amounts or the dates. You can also update the funding type reference, the funding amount, funding source renewal period. It can be on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, or a polyweekly basis. The funding start date and the end date. The funding outlet activity ID, which is commonly used as reference for DEX reporting. Funding fees, funding services, funding service billing categories, funding participation type, and the funding billing contacts. When you're done adding your funding sources, you can check the summary calculations display up top. This is where you can see the funding that's available per day, per week, per month, per year, and of course the total. Aside from viewing the total funding up top, there is also a summary of the fee types: funds in add to funding and funds in deduct from funding, which accounts for additional amounts to be paid by the client. This can help explain to a client how the income tested fee impacts the available funding. Once you're done adding the funding sources, you can scroll down to the next section to start adding the fees and charges. Fees are the amounts being charged to the client, such as service fees and fees related to their funding package. These are being charged directly to the client or deducted from the funding. These costs vary depending on the client's eligibility, the provider, level of care needs, and services requested. Some costs may also be paid by the client, relative, or friends, or the government through government contribution. Some examples are basic daily care fee and admin fees. Just like the funding source, you should have fee templates already set up on your settings area. So let's go ahead and add a fee. To add a fee, you can go ahead and click on the plus icon on the right side of the fee section. Then select the fees template. It's better if you select from here rather than adding a customized one for compliance purposes. This way, you can just customize the type, select if it's a fee percentage or amount, add the frequency when you're charging the fees, the rate if there's a custom rate, and then add the start date and end date. You can also add the fund type if the client is paying through the funding source. And then, of course, you can add multiple fees for every client. Earlier, I mentioned that you can add a fee type. You can choose between funds in deduct fees, funds in add fees, or funds out. If the client is required to pay a certain amount of money to receive funding, you can choose funds in deduct. Sometimes a funds in deduct fee can be waived, which means the client does not need to pay the amount, but the funding subsidy would still be deducted. The next fee type is called funds in add fees. You can choose funds in add fees when the client's funding source is not enough to cover a service they are receiving, or when the client opts to pay a top-up to the funding amount to receive GST-free services under the funding arrangement. Examples of this include basic daily care fee or private top-ups. And lastly, funds out fees. If you have additional charges, such as care management, admin fees, or if you have something like a vital call service with their funding source, you can choose funds out fees. After adding your funding sources and fees, it's time to add your services. This section of the code will give the client the full idea of how much it would actually cost to have services delivered for them. There are two types of services. The recurring services are what's going to be the service plan or the support plan, and one-off services, on the other hand, will allow you to add purchases or once-off services that are planned ahead. You can also use one-off services for your onboarding. For example, if you have a home risk assessment that you need to do, you can add it in as a one-off service. Here's a sample schedule. We have a personal care and home support service that's weekly and occurs every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 o'clock a.m. and it lasts for 120 minutes. There's also a travel with client component because the support worker may need to drive the client around town for errands. To start adding a recurring service, I'll just click on the plus icon on the right side. Then we need to select the personal care and home care service from the services field. Then we need to set the frequency as weekly. You can set the frequency as daily, weekly, fortnightly, monthly, annually, or something called polyweekly, which is, for example, like every 5 weeks or every 8 weeks. It gives you a lot more flexibility on your schedules. Let's add the date when the service starts as the start date. And if there is a definite date when the service stops, you can add the end date. Then we can tick the treatments. If the service is deliverable on a holiday, when the client is on leave, if you want to use the default funding source that is set on the client's profile, or if the service is a sleepover. Since we selected a weekly service, you can select the day of the week and then to add in the time, the duration, and the funding source to be used if you're not using the default funding source. After that, you can select the billing categories or the rates that apply to the service. The visit duration is how you charge your client or pay your staff based on the time or day of the week. For NDIS, this is where your weekend or weekday rates will apply. You can also add a rate override if you have a special rate for the client. The distance traveled with client line item allows you to set the rate for the travel and how you're billing the client and paying your staff. This can be based on the scheduled locations or the actual check-in or check-out locations, or based on what was reported by the staff members. The call-out fee is how you're paying your staff or in special cases bill your clients for the travel in between appointments. And then you can also set a rate if the service is going to be a sleepover. If you have any extra consumables or equipments you wish to charge the client for during the service, you can add the manual line item with the expected and actual rate. So I'll just go ahead and add the values in. So the quantities, the rates, the unit, and the GST treatments. Then I can also add more line items as well. So I can just click on add item up top. So now we're done with the Tuesday schedule. So I will go ahead and click on copy schedule so I don't need to fill out the same details. I can just change the day to Thursday and keep the same time, but definitely you can update the details if you want to. If you want to delete this new schedule right here, you can just click on the trash icon. To add another service, you can just click on the plus icon on the right side of the recurring services section. Sometimes your clients will need services during special circumstances. It could be because of an emergency, temporarily added services, or scheduled checkups. Once-off items or ad hoc bookings or service requests are also used for client purchases like assistive technologies or special merchandise. To add a once-off item, we can select the plus icon on the right side of the section. We'll select a service, so I will just go ahead and select a purchase service for oxygen tank replacement. As you can see, these are the same fields as the recurring services. The only difference is you are only allowed to select a specific date. You can select your funding source, the service treatments, if you are using the default funding source, or if the service is a sleepover. You can then add your visit duration, distance traveled with client, call-out distance, or sleepover line items, whichever applies. Then you can add the line items. I will go ahead and add the cost for the oxygen tank on the manual line item section. Once you're done adding your services, you can scroll down and attach supporting documents like a referral document, medical records, or requests. You can upload a PDF, document, video, or images. And finally, below the quote section is where you can see the cost breakdown and summary and the total cost of the quote. Once you're happy with your draft, you can click on Save. We have just saved a draft of a quote. This means you can still edit the quote, or you are still waiting for an internal approval in your organization. If you switch the status of a quote to open, it means you are ready to discuss it with the client. You can generate an agreement and a quote as a PDF file, and you can present it to the client. If negotiations fall through, or you can't get in touch with the client, you can tag the quote as cancelled. If the quote is marked open, and you are speaking with the client but they are not happy with the quote, you can mark the quote as rejected and create a new quote. If a client has accepted the quote over the phone or just said it in passing, you can mark the quote as accepted verbally. Your coordinators may need to secure an acceptance in writing either by signing the agreement or via email. When a quote has been fully accepted, it means that they have read the quote and have signed your agreement. When you switch the quote status to accepted, all of the details that you have added on the funding sources, on the fee section, recurring services, one-off items, all of that will flow through to the client's profile. On the client profile, to review your quotes, you can go to the Quotes and Contracts section. Under the active quotes, you can click on the different icons if you want to edit, if you want to print out a quote, if you want to print out an agreement, if you want to duplicate a quote. This is very useful if you're doing a renewal, if you want to archive a quote or delete a quote. So let's just click on Edit. Then to update the status, you can just click on the status drop-down. So I'll now select Open. Down below, you will see several buttons that are activated. You can generate an agreement from this section, generate a PDF of a quote, or click on Save. There are several notifications that will go out depending on the status. You can send a quote to a client after it's been marked open. You can notify anyone in your organization if the quote has been rejected. If a quote has been verbally accepted, you may need to send a notification to someone who can chase up the client for the signed agreement. And finally, a notification that will go out when the quote has been finally accepted. These notifications are set during the configuration stage, but you can contact the CareVision team if you want extra help in setting these notifications. If you have any questions around this topic, you can check out our website at carevision.com and chat with our friendly web support team.